us to give a reflection this evening for your community, for your outreach, to talk a little bit about the season of Lent, to give a Lenten reflection. I want to start with a passage from Matthew 9, verse 14 till 17. Okay, Matthew 9, verse 14 till 17. So in this, there is a discussion about fasting that there is with John's disciples. Then John's disciples came to him and said, "Why is it that we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not?" Jesus replied, "Surely the bridegroom's attendants cannot mourn as long as the bridegroom is still with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunken cloth onto an old cloak, because the patch pulls away from the cloak and the tear gets worse. Nor do people put new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the skins burst, the wine runs out, and the skins are lost. No, they put new wine in fresh wineskins, and both are preserved." So in this short passage, we hear this question being asked by the disciples of John the Baptist. Why do they fast? Why do the Pharisees fast? But then Jesus' disciples don't seem to be fasting. And I'm quite intrigued by the answer that Jesus gives. Jesus gives the answer that as long as the bridegroom is still with them, the attendants will not mourn. So he's not using the word fasting here, but he is using the word mourning here. So the question is, why don't they fast? And he answers with, as long as the bridegroom is still around, the wedding attendants do not mourn. And then he continues, but the time will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. And so the question is fasting. The answer is about mourning, and then, but if the bridegroom is taken away, they will fast. So Jesus seems to be using this word mourning and the word fasting interchangeably. As long as the bridegroom is around, and no need for fasting, no need for mourning. But if the bridegroom is taken away, then mourning, fasting is appropriate. And then the verse 16 and 17 is about if you put a new piece of cloth on an old piece of cloth, then it will tear the old one. Or if you put new wine in old wineskins, they will burst. So new wine, fresh wineskins. In other words, there is a need for new wineskins. There is a need for a new piece of cloth in order to make it work. And this, of course, has everything to do with the gospel message that Christ comes to bring, this new life that Christ is offering. So how is this related to the season of Lent, a season that is often marked by fasting, almsgiving, and prayer? And I'm not sure how it is for you, but often when Lent comes, often I'm a little bit late with preparing because I wait for Lent to start to really think, okay, what shall this Lent be about? What is the focus of Lent, rather than having a plan ahead of Lent? And then once Lent starts, you get into the rhythm of Lent. Okay, you have Ash Wednesday, and then Friday you have Stations of the Cross, and what the tendency or the temptation is that it is just going to be another Lent. Lent passes by every year. It's 40 days, or with the Sundays 46 days, and after 46 days, we felt we have sacrificed a little bit, but have we really grown? Have we really changed? Has it really made any difference in our life, or was it just another Lent? And I think that quite a few homilies that I heard, or a few priests that speak on YouTube, all seems to be giving this message of let it not just be another Lent. And when we fast, let's not just make it random. Let's be intentional about what this journey is about. Now, Lent in Latin is called Quadragesima, because the English word for this season is a little bit deceiving, because it's really only as far as I know, only the English language calls this season Lent, because Lent comes from springtime, uh, which rather has to do with the season of the year, that Lent seems to be happening in springtime. And so spring is also new flowers, new and new life. And so it can be related to this season also of preparation for Easter. But in the Latin language, which is the official language of the church, this season is called Quadragesima. And most other languages, including my own, which is I'm from Holland, so we speak Dutch. This season would literally translated mean 40 days time. And so in Latin or in most languages, this season is not known as springtime or Lent, but rather as 40 days time. And why these 40 days? Because technically, actually, it's 46, but we exclude the Sundays because the Sundays are always days of celebrating the resurrection. So we don't fast on Sundays. So you exclude those, and you have a 40-day period from Ash Wednesday. If you really count all the 40 days, it would include Holy Saturday, although actually the season of Lent ends at Good Friday, because then we are, or Holy Thursday evening, then we enter into the Paschal Triduum. This 40 days times, of course, reminds us of Jesus. Jesus who before his public ministry spent 40 days in the desert. He after his baptism, he retrieved into the desert where he fasted for 40 days to prepare for his mission. Yeah? 40 days, a number in the Bible, often has a symbolic meaning, and 40 always has something to do with preparation. And so Jesus prepares for his work of mission. He's making a transition from living with at home, doing the work that his father does, being a carpenter with Joseph, to now becoming into the call that is really the heart of his mission, to preach the good news, to travel across the Holy Land, to preach the good news, to gather the disciples, and then ultimately give his life, die and rise for the forgiveness of our sins. For 40 days, Jesus prepares with fasting for this mission. And as part of that 40 days, we know there was also, it ends with that, the temptations of the devil that tempt him on his identity. If you are the Son of God, then do this. If you are the Son of God, then do this. It is the devil is attacking his identity, who he really is. If we don't know who we are, if we don't know our identity as sons and daughters of God, of who we really are, then we will be tempted to live a very ordinary life, to blend in, to do what everybody else does, to go with the stream. But if we are rooted in our identity as sons and daughters of God, if we know the privilege of our calling, the dignity of our identity as the beloved of God, as his sons and daughters, then our mission will flow from there. Then we want to live a different life. We want to go against the stream. We want to be countercultural in order to make Christ known. 40 days Jesus prepares for his mission. 40 days also remind us of another 40 period, not 40 days, but a 40 years period, which is the period that the Israelites spent in the desert. And this is really more of the focus of my talk tonight. As you see at my backdrop, this verse from Exodus 12, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. The Israelites ended up in Egypt because of the famine. Then they ended up being enslaved in that land, and they were used as the labor force to build the cities of the Egyptians. They were mistreated. They were slaves. And ultimately, Moses became aware of who he was, his identity, that his identity is not with the Egyptians, but his identity is with the Israelites. He belongs to the people of God, and he has then also this longing. I want to bring the people out of Egypt. First, he does it by his own strength. He stands up for some injustice that is happening. He sees an Egyptian slave owner hitting one of the Israelites, and he steps in, and ultimately this guy gets killed. But as a result of it, Moses needs to flee the country. He had a good idea. He wanted to free the Israelites. He had a glimpse of what his mission, his call was about, but he started to use it by his own strength, by his own idea, and that failed. And so he ended up having to flee the country. He went into the desert, where he spent 40 years in the desert, 40 years until he got the call of God by the burning bush to now go back. By then, he is already 80 years old, and he's sent back to Egypt now to bring the Israelites out. But now it's not going to be by his own strength. Now it's going to be by God's strength. Through the 10 plagues, God frees the Israelites from the land of slavery by the hand of Moses. And so they leave the promised land, and then they flee for their life. They cross the Red Sea, and then they are in the desert. Now they spent 40 years in the desert, but don't make the mistake of thinking that it takes 40 years to walk from Egypt to Israel. To walk from Egypt to Israel, even with a big group, would have taken a matter of weeks or months, but not a matter of years, let alone 40 years. In 40 years, I think you can walk around the earth, and it's not from Egypt to the promised land takes 40 years. So why do they spend 40 years in the desert? The reason they spent 40 years in the desert, we know from the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers, in chapter 13, we read the story about the 12 spies. In Numbers 13, since there are 12 tribes, they call upon 12 men, one per tribe, to be sent into the promised land to go ahead and to observe what is there, to become aware of what is the area they're entering into, and then to make a report. And so 40 days they spend in the promised land, and after that they come back. And when they come back, they report. And we read the report in verse 27 of Numbers 13. This was the report they gave. We made our way into the country where you sent us. It does indeed flow with milk and honey. Here is what it produces. At the same time, its inhabitants are a powerful people. The towns are fortified and very big. Yes, and we saw the Anakim there. The Amalekites, and then who occupied some season. And then Caleb called the people around Moses to silence and said, we must march in immediately and take it. We are certainly able to conquer it. But the men who had been with him said, we cannot attack these people. They are stronger than we are. And they began disparaging the Israelites and the country they reconnoitered, saying, the country we have been to reconnoiter is the country that devours its inhabitants. All the people we saw there were of enormous size. We saw giants there too. We felt like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So the spies giving an account of what is happening in the promised land, they recognize that it is indeed a land of milk and honey. It is the land that God has promised. It's good to be there. At the same time, they have seen giants. They have seen how big the people are there, and they got scared. Even though they had seen the miracles in the desert, they had seen God opening up the Red Sea for them. They knew God was with them, and yet they failed to put their trust in Him. And so, while only two of the spies, which is Caleb and Joshua, said we can take the land, the other 10 start to worry the people and say that no, we cannot take this land. We should and not enter here. We will be killed. Because of that, and because then the whole the whole people start to be afraid and they are not willing to go in, and then God sends them back. He sends them back into the desert for one day that they spend in the promised land. They are sent back for 1 year. So they end up 40 years back in the desert. 40 years, which is also kind of, especially in those days, the length of a generation. So those that were standing there at the um, at the entrance of the promised land and were sent back into the desert, they will not enter the promised land at all. They are sent back into the desert. They will die in the desert, but their offspring, their children, will be the ones that will then, by Joshua, be led into the promised land. Why am I telling this story? It didn't take so long actually to get the people out of Egypt, but it takes a lot longer to get Egypt out of us. It takes much lesser work to get the people out of Egypt, but to really get Egypt out of the people is a lot longer work. You can see it happening immediately. They are in the desert. They have seen God, the 10 plagues. They have seen the Red Sea parting. They know God is with them. They should have put their trust in God, but yet they start to complain. And they say, why have you led us here into the desert to die? At least in Egypt we had to eat. They started to long back for the meat that they were able to eat in Egypt, because in the desert they had nothing to eat, or no water to drink. This longing back for Egypt comes back again and again in the story of the desert. Again and again they will complain to Moses and Aaron that, why have you let us out? At least in Egypt we had food to eat. We knew where we were. There is this attachment. There is this inner attachment that at the slightest challenge, they will long back for Egypt. God sends them back for 40 years into the desert to really make this transition, to get Egypt out of the system of the people of God, so that those who are going to enter the land of freedom, those who are going to enter the promised land, are going to be people who do not have Egypt in them, who are entirely free of the mindset of slavery, of the Egyptian mindset, so that they can be free to enter the promised land. And this transition needs to happen. I think what needs to happen, and this then really is where it's going to apply to our journey, is that whenever we are going to make this transition from slavery to freedom, from Egypt to the promised land, we need to, in some sense, grieve Egypt in order to become free to enter the promised land. We need to let go of the past in order to be able to be free to move forward. That's why I read this passage from Matthew 9, where Jesus was asked, why don't your disciples fast? And Jesus says, as long as the bridegroom is with them, they do not need to grieve. But when the bridegroom is taken away, then they will fast. So it seems to me that what Jesus is proposing, what Jesus is telling us, is that the fast that we need is a form of grieving, is a form of letting go of the old in order to become free for the new. That's why in the next verses it was the new wine needs to go into new wineskins. But the problem very often in our own life is that we try to make a hybrid. We have our old attachments, we have our old wineskins, and we try to fit Christianity, we try to fit our way of prayer, our way of thinking, our way of doing, kind of mix and match into this old system. So as we start this season of Lent, maybe we can ponder for a moment, and maybe I'm just going to take a minute or two of silence, and I just want you to ponder for a moment. What is some of the Egypt that is still in you? What is some of the old ways of thinking that is still in your system? And maybe it could be an area of sin that you are attached to. Maybe it could be an area of addiction, whether it's workaholism, or whether it's pornography, or whether it's shopaholism, or an addiction to your status. Maybe it is a certain mindset, certain ways that you have been doing things and you know they are no longer working, but yet you still perpetuate this way of doing them because you are so used to it. A certain way of praying, a certain way of talking to people, a certain way of relating to family members or friends, a certain way maybe even of doing mission. Just because we were taught 20 years ago, 30 years ago, a certain way of mission, and in all these years we have never really evolved in the way that we do outreach. And sometimes we can get stuck. What are some of these old ways that we are stuck in? The Egypt. So I'm just going to take a minute of silence to give some space for you to think. What is the old way, maybe that the Lord is revealing to you right now, that you are stuck in? Hopefully you have thought of something that maybe is speaking to you right now, of something you are clinging to. Although, of course, you have made your way to the land of freedom to be in Christ, and yet you recognize there is a certain old way of doing things. There is still a certain attachment to sin or addiction or ways that are no longer working. And what is the freedom that Christ is inviting you to? Maybe I just give examples of myself. This example is not really a testimony because it is more what God is now pointing out in my life. I take my prayer life very seriously. There was years ago, my prayer life was very irregular, and at some point, I knew that if I want to really grow in my faith, if I want to take my faith serious, then I need to put my daily prayer in place. And so I became very intentional about it. I remember several years ago, um, I I started with half an hour each day, and then at some length, I said, okay, let me increase it to 45 minutes, and then a couple of years later, then I said, okay, let me make it 1 hour. And ever since, I've been praying 1 hour every day without fail. I simply will not go to sleep unless I have prayed for 1 hour, because that's my commitment to God. And I know that unless I have that commitment, I'm not going to do it. So this commitment helps me, and so I stick to at least 1 hour of prayer every day, to pray with the scriptures, to spend quality time with God, because that has really helped me. Because there are days when you don't feel like praying, when you're tired or busy, but all the more actually then I need prayer. And so I've made it a point to really make that part and parcel of my everyday life, to stick to my hour of prayer. Over time, of course, I work in a parish as a pastoral worker. I part of the ICPE Mission Singapore. So along the way, a lot of people will ask for prayers. A person who is sick, a person who is dying, a family member who is sick, or pray for this community, for this outreach, for this mission, for this struggle. And so over time, a lot of intercession became part of my hour of prayer. Now, I think intercession is great, intercession is important, and we should spend time interceding. But in the last year or so, I think quite time and again, God has been pointing the finger at my prayer life and saying, you spend that hour of prayer with me, but most of the time you're just interceding. You're just mentioning people's names or different communities or different outreaches that you are praying for. And while that is good, deep down in my heart, I know God is inviting me that maybe I should give less space to intercession so that I can actually give more space of my prayer to really intimacy with God, to really listen to Him, to really spend time just sitting with Him. Now, this is not an example of going from sin to virtue. This is an area that actually is good. It's intercession. Intercession should be a good thing. And yet it could be that I'm clinging to an old way of praying that I'm familiar with, that, or maybe I spend a large portion of my daily prayer simply interceding. But in this season, I feel that God is inviting me to let it go in order to make more space for other types of prayer, for a more intimate type of prayer, more of listening, of being empowered by Him. And while I'm saying that, and this message actually is not new to me, God has been trying to point it out to me for several months now. And yet, every time that I really try and do away with my intercession or shorten my intercession, I struggle. Because somehow I still feel that, no, but I should pray for this community and I should pray for this person. And somehow there is still an attachment to this intercession, because somehow I think it's good, it's important, or I have committed to it, or I've even told these people I will pray for you. And in some sense, actually, it has enslaved my prayer time. I have allowed myself to be bound up because of this commitment, because of my own made up rules about how I should pray. Sometimes, even in the area of prayer, we have allowed ourselves to maybe get stuck in a certain way of praying, in a certain devotion, in a certain way of interceding, in a certain way of reading the scriptures, in a certain way of attending mass. And have we come up with a way of doing things that maybe are no longer helpful? Maybe they were helpful 10 years ago in your life when you were in a different season and you needed certain structure, but now the structure has become the holy cow, and you get stuck in the structure rather than being in that freedom that God is inviting us into, to go deeper. Christ is inviting us to make this transition from the land of slavery to the land of the promise, the land of freedom. And therefore, we have to grieve. We have to grieve the old. Now, maybe if you're familiar with a little bit of psychology, you probably have heard of the 5 stages of grief that are commonly experienced when grieving loss: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. Now, these are not per se linear. It doesn't always go from one to the other, but often people experience these 4 stages before they really come to this place of acceptance. And in some way, we can even see this happening to the Israelites in the desert. First, they leave the promised land, and after they have crossed the Red Sea, they are singing this song of victory as if they are already in the promised land. But the reality is they are just out of Egypt. And it doesn't take very long before in the next chapter already they are in this stage of anger where they complain against Moses. Why have you led us out of Egypt? Maybe we should go back. Maybe it was better there. What often I think is holding us back from transitioning into this greater space of freedom that God is inviting us into is that either we are denying that there is a problem in our life. We say, "Oh, I'm okay. Actually, there's no issue," but we are so stuck in our way of doing things that we do not really even know what the promised land looked like. We do not know what real freedom actually tastes like, and we live in this denial of, "Oh, I'm okay. There's no real problem in my life." But there is always a greater freedom that we are called to. There is always some sin that is still at work in our life. There is always still an old way that we are dealing with. Anger. Why am I in this space? Why me? Why am I struggling with this sin or this addiction? Why me? It may then lead to bargaining. If you do this for me, then I will do this. Even Moses will at some points bargain with the Lord. If truly I enjoy your favor, then do this for me. And this if then kind of bargaining, sometimes we will do it with the Lord as well. Or it could lead to depression, where we come into this space where we think there is no way out. I'm struggling with this addiction, and I don't think that freedom is actually possible, and it may lead to a sense of depression, of hopelessness, where really that mind change needs to happen, that change is possible, freedom is possible, to coming to a place of really accepting the change, accepting that when we go from Egypt to the promised land, it involves leaving Egypt behind. And the truth may be that there are certain aspects of Egypt that we kind of enjoyed. There may even be things in Egypt that were good, even though it was the land of slavery, but many of the Israelites were born in Egypt. It was the land that they were born. It's where they made friendships. Some of them may have gotten married there. So they have also a lot of good memories to Egypt that they long back to. And so when we make that transition, it's not that we have to wholesale deny everything. We deny the slavery part, we deny the sin part, but we may need to bring along some of these, some of the things, how it has helped us. Now, another model of grief is called the dual process model of grief, in which there is this sense of loss orientation and restoration orientation. When grieving, for example, somebody who has died and you grieve, the person having to deal with grief kind of would go back and forth between thinking about the person, telling stories, looking at photos, recalling memories. And there is a certain need for us to think back of the old and to celebrate even the good that was there, so that then the person can move forward into the restoration in making the changes that are needed, finding new ways of doing things. Now, in the journey that the Israelites made from Egypt to the Promised Land, we see also these two elements happening. There is a certain memory that needs to take place of the old. In the Jewish tradition of the Old Testament, you have the Passover meal. In the Passover meal, which the Jews even till today celebrate every year, it's a memorial meal. And in that memorial meal, they will slaughter a lamb to remind them that by the blood of the lamb, they were led out of Egypt to the Promised Land. But there are also other dishes that will remind them of the bitter herbs, that reminds them of their bitter times. Something else that reminds them of the mortar they put between the bricks when they built the cities. So there are different elements of the memorial meal that remind them of how it was in order to really come to this new place of freedom. The ultimate memorial meal, which is the fulfillment of the Passover meal, is the Eucharist. In the Eucharist, Christ himself becomes our Passover sacrifice and says, take this, all of you, this is my body given for you. Do this in memory of me. Our journey always involves memory. What is the all that we are leaving behind in order to transition to this new that God is inviting us to? In the Passover mystery, there is always the dying so that we can come to the rising. In this season of Lent, I think that this should be the journey. What are some of the attachments that we really need to die to, that we need to leave behind? And maybe you need to grieve them. Maybe you need to spend some time building an altar and thanking God for that, even that this old way maybe has served me for a while, but now I'm letting it go. When the Israelites finally reached the Promised Land in Joshua 4, and they crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land, and they built an altar in the middle of the Jordan, because the River Jordan splits into half. They built 12 memorial stones in the middle, and then when they finally reached the Promised Land, they built another 12 memorial stones. We too need to sometimes mark moments and build an altar to say, this old way, I'm leaving it behind. It wasn't helpful in this way. Maybe it was helpful in that way, but Lord, I just want to thank you because you were there with me. I'm not proud of my addictions in my life, but even in the time of addiction, when I did things that God didn't like, God was still with me. And so while I have to reject my sinfulness, I do not need to reject my past. And I should bring this into my journey of faith, because then it becomes a testimony. Then I can say, yeah, in the past, when I did this and this and this, God was actually with me. And for that, I'm grateful. It was when I was struggling that I continually had to come to my knees, that I continually had to flee to confession, that I continually had to flee to my brothers and sisters in community to pray with me, to stand with me. And though I was struggling, God was with me. And for that, I'm grateful. But now I'm transitioning into this land of freedom where I no longer need this addiction. And I'm going to build a new altar, a new place of prayer, a new way of relating in this space of freedom as the children of God, where I can build better relationships with my brothers and sisters, where I can build a more healthy relationship with God, where I can really grow in holiness and freedom so that I can then live out my mission. So as I'm going to close, what is the all that you need to leave behind? And what is the freedom that Christ is inviting you into? And as this week, as we come to the first Sunday of Lent, maybe you want to take a moment to relook at your Lenten resolutions. I'm very sure all of us have some Lenten resolutions. Maybe some of them were a little bit random. If they were too random, maybe just let them go. And instead, I would propose focus your Lenten resolutions more intentionally on an area where you need to grow. Maybe you have a very difficult relationship with an in-law or with a brother or sister. Why don't you make a resolution for this Lent to intentionally visit that person, or write a letter to that person, or give that person a phone call or visit? Something that is really related to that area of change that you want to make. Maybe it is a certain old way of prayer that you want to let go of. And what is this new way of prayer? And start to practice this new way of praying. Maybe it's an old way of doing mission, and Christ is inviting you to a new way of mission. What is the fasting? What is the almsgiving or charity? What is the prayer that I need in this season of my life that can help me move from the old to the new? So let me close with this verse with which we started from Matthew 9, in which he speaks about fasting as mourning. And he says in verse 16 and 17, "No one puts a piece of unshrunken cloth on an old cloak, because the patch pulls away from the cloak and the tear gets worse. Nor do people put new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the skins burst and the wine runs out, and the skins are lost. No, they put new wine in fresh wineskins, and both are preserved." So what is the new wineskin that you need? And let your Lenten resolutions really be a model of this new wineskin that you want to embrace, so that Lent isn't just for Lenten's sake, and then after 40 days it's over, but Lent will really be a way of preparing a new way of life that leads into Easter and way beyond, so that this year will really not be another Lent, but a time of growth, a time of transition from the old to the new, a time of really coming to a place of greater freedom. This is my prayer for you. Whatever spoke to you, I hope that you can take it home and make this Lenten season all the more fruitful because of it. So thank you for listening.